So Claire Wardle, she is the former researcher fellow at the Harvard Shorenstein Center, but currently she's the executive director of First Draft. First Draft is a nonprofit dedicated to addressing misinformation and disinformation. And then Camille, formerly a principal researcher at Google, is now the chief innovation officer at Graphika. Graphika is a company based in New York City that kind of maps and investigates what's happening online. And you're also currently a Mozilla fellow.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think just to start, just to kind of level set, I was hoping you guys could explain the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Any of you guys can take that one.
So I'll take this one because about 2 years ago I got so frustrated at the use of the term F*** news that I was like, we need better terminology. And mis and disinformation have been around for a long time. Disinformation is false information that is deliberately created and spread to cause harm. Misinformation is false information, but the people spreading it don't realize that it's harmful. So I always talk about my mom, a little bit like the previous panel. If she sees a shark photo during a hurricane, she forwards it, being like, oh my God, the shark. But she doesn't know that she's causing harm. But I also talk about, create a set of terms with Hossein Darakshan about malinformation, which actually we're seeing a lot more of, which is genuine information that is shared to cause harm. So that might be the deliberately leaking of information that's harmful. It might be revenge porn. It might be a genuine photo that's reshared and people think that it's current. So we just need complexity in this space because we're 3 years into this moment where all of a sudden everybody worried about, when I say everybody, I mean the US and the UK. Yeah. The rest of the world were like, yeah, welcome to the party. But in that time, we're still talking about it as these big buckets, and actually we're not getting to the heart of the problem because we're using these terms in a false way.
That's a great way to sum it up. Is there anything else on top of that?
No, I agree. I kind of wonder where you put Donald Trump in your classification, but that might be a question for later. I tend to break down this hairy problem of disinformation according to 3 vectors, right? Like, it could be about the actors behind it. If you're an account that's pretending to be an American activist, but really you're run by Russian military intelligence, you're disinformation because of the actor that's behind the account. Behavior is another dimension, right? I'm going ABC just so that you can follow along. So actor, behavior. For instance, if there's an information that's actually disseminated by an actor who say who they are and the content is right, but they're disseminated by bots or by any strategy that makes it look like the content is much more popular than what it actually is, it's not about the actor, it's not about the content, it's about the behavior of how it's being disseminated. And finally, you have content problems, right? So sometimes you have content that's really designed to be disinformative. So deep fakes would go into this along with all the other less deep types of fakery.
That's great. Okay, so now is the game show part.
Okay, also now I'm realizing that a flip chart marker is not a whiteboard marker.
Oh, you don't think it'll, do we have another marker?
I tested it.
Oh, they'll test it,
did some testing, just spit on it. And then
okay, sounds good. I'll do it.
Yeah, I think that'll work.
Sounds good.
So the first question, which platform do you think is the worst when it comes to disinformation? And write your answers on the whiteboard.
Question.
And you have 30 seconds on the clock. That's actually a lot of time.
We talked about this earlier when it's like it's a game of misses and misses.
Okay.
That's before a lot of people came in this room.
Camille?
Well, I mean, it's working-ish.
Okay.
You'll
and
see shapes and I'll justify.
I hope you guys reveal your answers at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like a moment.
Say like 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. I was thinking 3, 2, 1.
Okay, go.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
V-contact.
Oh, she's so Russian.
Well, we should talk about YouTube. I don't even know what V-contact.
I'm not Russian, but...
But you spent a lot of time in that.
Yeah, true. No, but I actually don't mean that. So V-contact is the Russian Facebook. And it's top of mind for me because when major American or European platforms focus on specific groups that they want to remove from their platforms, those groups don't go off the internet. And so, for instance, when we work on violent extremist groups, or when we work on the groups in Myanmar, for instance, who were responsible for most of the dangerous content, once they're off Facebook and off Twitter and off Google, we see them a lot on V-contact. And so it's, I'm not trying to avoid pointing fingers at any big platforms. I'm not trying to be cheeky. I'm just saying we have to think about smaller platforms where our moderation or frankly like our accountability don't reach because those bad actors don't stop to do harm once we don't see them on Facebook.
which is a good point. When I mean, we're seeing more evidence now that deplatforming does work,
Right.
but it's not as if it disappears.
Yeah.
So in the same way as obviously there's a lot of emphasis on WhatsApp, and that also is a cesspool. But increasingly, we're seeing these sort of movements moving on to Telegram now that 8chan has come down. So
Right.
contact Telegram. Like, if we don't have a real understanding of the whole ecosystem,
Right.
it's not that we don't have problems with the big platforms, but we have to understand those
Another way
fringe
to
spaces.
another way to put it is that it's not because it's no longer a problem for Facebook that it's no longer a problem for democracy. Sometimes there are things that are no longer a problem for Facebook or Google or whatnot that are still really, really problematic when you care about the health of the internet. Yes. So that's for vContact.
Yes, I love
Talk to me about YouTube.
No, I mean, it's because we work globally.
Yeah.
And so my frustration, for example, we did a lot of work in Brazil, is that, WhatsApp is the place lots of people talk about, but there's so much stuff on YouTube that's really, really problematic. And there's different YouTube. So there's the big YouTube that lots of people go and access every day, and it's great. But there are lots of YouTubes that we don't spend time in. And because it's so difficult to monitor video, we're getting better now with closed captioning, but it's still really, really difficult. Then we don't necessarily understand what's happening there. But those radicalization routes that we all know about, it just frustrates me because it is mainstream, it is owned by Alphabet, and they're getting away with murder because we're not giving it the scrutiny that we should be, partly because it's so difficult to monitor, and nobody wants to watch hours and hours of this really horrific stuff.
Yeah, I
YouTube's
mean,
a good answer.
so is vContact. So is
We're both
VK.
good answers. We're both winners.
You guys are just a pair of people. Yeah, I want to talk about video a little bit because you made a video on the New York Times where you became Adele. You were Adele, and you were saying whatever you wanted to say. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah,
Have
so
to sing it.
Hello? No. So it was partly because I was ranting constantly about the way that journalists were talking about deep fakes. And it's not as if we don't have to worry about deep fakes, but the bigger concern is if we talk about it in the way that we currently are, we're doing the work of the agents of disinformation, which is to make everybody terrified about what they're seeing with their own eyes. And I think we're honestly about 2 years away from a point where the majority of the population doesn't see video as evidence. And that is much scarier than deepfakes. And deepfakes, particularly at the moment around pornography, is the bit that we should be talking about. 96% of deepfakes are actually women's faces put into pornography. So it's not that it's not a problem, but I was busy ranting. So the New York Times said, do you want to do a video, and rant in a video? And I was like, yes, please. And then they said, when I was being filmed, they're like, oh, we're going to turn you into Adele, which is a little bit like a bucket list moment. But then I felt bad, like, who's asked Adele? Maybe she doesn't want to be Claire Wardle. So I was like, what are the ethics of this? And then I was like, sod it. And so what it meant was that lots of people watched the video, and I was like, oh, that was the purpose. And it's not like I'm single-handedly changing newspaper coverage of it, but the way the media talk about deepfakes is much, much worse than, I would argue, the technology.
Yeah, what are some things that we should talk about more, would you say? I'm in the media, so I could use this for my own job.
Yeah.
Personally asking now.
So, for example, this is being live streamed, right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so there was a major news organization that brought me in about 3 weeks ago to talk about the fear of deep fakes in 2020. And I said, I promise you, hand on heart, that's not going to be the problem. The problem is you guys running with a piece of original content that's 3 years old. And they were like, oh, I don't think so, I don't think so. And let's just say it was potentially an American news organization, ABC, which a week later ran footage that they said was from Syria, but actually it was a Kentucky gun show from 3 years ago. And so the bigger problem we have is just that low level, often genuine content, or I always talk about the drip, 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 drip of hyper-partisan content. We're not doing longitudinal studies about individual memes might seem harmless and a bit of fun, but what does it look like if continuously you see that stuff? And so I think we focus on the sensational and the obviously fabricated, and actually the bigger problem is the low-level, hyper-partisan, polarizing, misogynistic, low-level racist.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit. This is going to be another game show question. There's so many flavors of deep fakes. What do you think most of them are trying to accomplish? What are they mostly political intrigue? Is it mostly memes? Is it mostly porn? What is it mostly?
Deep fakes or any type of fake?
Deep fakes.
Oh.
Yeah. We can do another reveal. Did you write VK again?
No.
Okay. All right. 3, 2, 1, reveal.
Porn?
Porn. Okay.
Porn, definitely.
Okay. Got you.
Yeah.
Just wanted to put that.
Deepfakes is for porn.
That's unfortunate. I mean, I think about, we live in a world where there's, revenge porn. And that could be like kind of harmful too, not just kind of like really.
Yeah, but I mean, we know this is like most innovation comes out of pornography, always has. This is another one, but we're not talking about it because surprise, surprise, the people who are victims are women.
Yeah.
And so like, it's just not discussed in the way that it should. And I mean, even women, in fact, like how many of our faces are out there in these databases and how easy it is to put any of our faces out there in a pornographic place and not even know that it's happening. That's the other thing. It's terrible, full stop, but it's also terrible. God knows where my face is right now.
Don't.
Yeah.
I hope only on the stage. I don't know what's out there.
Too.
But I think there's something to what Claire was saying on, if you look at, so in my work, I look at a lot of very sophisticated disinformation campaigns that are run by actors such as government that have a lot of funding and a lot of people to do this harm, right? And so it's interesting that they don't use deepfakes. The reason why they don't use deepfakes is not because they're lacking the budget for it or lacking the people to do it or lacking the source material, right? The reason why, for instance, in Syria, the disinformation campaign that you see are using footage from one place and claiming that it's another place, which is something you would want to do, for instance, if you're covering up a war crime, it's because it's actually really hard to run the forensics on an image and to say, oh, here, I actually think that the image you're presenting to me has been decontextualized. And it's doable, right? Open source in investigative techniques are growing. There are fantastic groups like Bellingcat. But I think it's not considered to be a sexy tech problem. There's so much funding and attention that goes into, let's detect the deepfakes, when actually the lot of the hard work of the forensics that people need, in newsrooms or just in general to be supported to do is, let's make sure that the image you're presenting me is what you say it is, and it's not decontextualized or just taken from somewhere else. And again, it's less sexy, but it's really important.
Yeah, I think a case study that's interesting is during the Brazilian election, somebody impersonated Bolsonaro. Do you remember when he was stabbed and he was in hospital? Somebody pretended to be Bolsonaro and they recorded him from his hospital bed. And it went viral on WhatsApp as audio messages. So again, unless you're doing a lot of work in places like Nigeria or India or Brazil where audio messages are a real problem, it took 2 days to do the forensic analysis to work out that audio recording wasn't Bolsonaro because his pitch was slightly wrong when he used the letter R. But 2 days, by that time, it was everywhere on WhatsApp. So when people talk about deep fakes, I'm like, you get an impersonator of Donald Trump, you could do as much damage as doing a Donald Trump deep fake video. It's audio that we are in no way ready for.
Wow.
Not to mention text. I mean, the machine-generated blocks of text that look like they've been written by a human, for me, are a terrifying prospect in the future of disinformation. When we look at troll farms, the people they recruit, usually in online adverts, it's actually quite fun to read them, are people that they recruit to write believable content on bullshit blogs so that eventually they can weaponize the blog and then put political content in it. If it becomes so much easier to just do machine-generated text that creates all these blogs without having to pay someone to curate them, then that's bad news for fake news.
Yeah, that's a that's a good line. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I was going to ask you next was what we recently saw when Elizabeth Warren, who's running for Democratic nominee for president in the United States, she put a fake ad on Facebook about fake ads on Facebook, and it said first line, Zuckerberg comes out in support for Donald Trump, and then the second line said, "Did you believe that? This is a fake ad." It's 4 years later. It's almost 4 years later since the 2016 elections. Why is Facebook still having trouble with this?
Well, actually, this morning, I don't know if you've seen it, but if you saw the AOC questioning of Mark Zuckerberg this week, and she said, what happened if somebody pretends that a Republican supports a Green New Deal? And so an activist group has done exactly that. They've put out an ad on Facebook saying that Lindsey Graham supports a Green New Deal, which is like...
Amazing.
But they've done research that's like a lot of people believe this. I mean, it's a bigger conversation about this ridiculous position that Facebook has taken on advertising. There is no way that I think they can stand behind it. And I think actually the Elizabeth Warren and this AOC one is an example of you cannot pretend that you can't fact check. And the reason that a lot of fact checking organizations emerged in the late 1990s was because there was a growth of problematic claims on TV advertising. So all these fact checking groups emerged, and simply by being the watchdog, false claims in TV advertising dropped. So people go, well, it's the same on Facebook. We just have to monitor. But the Facebook ads API, as we know from the amazing work from Mozilla, is dreadful. So if we can't actually monitor these ads, then that argument completely falls on its face because we can't hold them to account. So I really, really hope that they change their mind on this before 2020. If they don't, we're absolutely screwed.
Yeah, Camille, I remember like recently after Zuckerberg went to Georgetown where he said that it's not my job to police what politicians say. Is that a good enough answer? Is that not good enough? What do you think about that?
I mean, I don't know, is
Yeah.
the truth. Yeah, politicians lie. That's true.
That's a true story.
That's true.
In the 21st century, politicians lie on Facebook. That sucks. I think this is one bucket of issues. And frankly, like, I think my own personal feelings on this don't really matter. I tend to focus on, again, like if you go to ABC, actors and behavior and content, content is easy to obsess on because we can look at it and we can say, oh, I think it's true, I think it's not true, I think it's a lie, I don't think it's a lie, I think you manipulated the video, and like you can argue on this. I tend to worry a little bit more about behaviors. Like, what are the politicians who are running campaigns with amplified bots and trolls, right? Like, you don't see that shit. It's more problematic because it's less easy for consumers and for individuals to just be online and be like, oh, I'm being manipulated, right? Like the information asymmetry between the internet user and the platform on everything that touches upon behavior is gigantic. So I'm more worried about like politicians using bots and trolls and like a lot of weird behavioral manipulation technique on social media for their campaigns, which we never talk about. And I'm more worried about actors who are creating like fake personas. Same thing. It's very hard for the users to see. I'm a little bit less worried about like who says what type of bullshit in ads. I think that's like an American politics problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I think going back to like.
But I'm not trying to be cheeky. I'm serious. Like,
yeah.
As we head towards 2020, there's still zero serious debate in America about how campaigns and candidates are going to use or not to use social media, right? Will they use fake profiles? Will they use bots? You know, what's the limit of what they're going to do? No one has gone and said, hey, by the way, I'm not going to do this. This is my own code of conduct for my campaign. And I'll give you a small example of like why that matters and how this can like really break down into collective hysteria. In 2018, during the midterms, one day I wake up and there's all these Ted Cruz supporter messages, and they're all saying the exact same thing at the exact same time. And so my phone explodes and my computer explodes, and everyone's running around being like, the Russian trolls are here for Ted Cruz. It's like, so we start running the forensics, and we're like, I don't know, guys, it doesn't look like Russian trolls. And like, next thing it was like, the bots are here, blah, 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 right? In reality, what had happened is the senator had created a campaign app, right? And his supporters had downloaded the campaign app, and they had willingly agreed for the campaign app to share messages on social media by giving an auth token, right? So it was not fake, nor was it done without the consent of the users. It did look like kind of weird, but this is still something that technically is supposed to be okay, and it was technically okay too by Twitter's own senders. Is that okay? Is that the type of use that we want? Again, if we don't have a serious conversation about the types of behaviors that we want to see in campaigns, we're bound to freak out every time someone does something innovative on social media, and we're bound to call a troll and a bot everything that's like looking kind of weird.
You make a really good point. I think what I want to ask both of you guys right now is like, what is your wish list of what's in bounds? Like a politician says, I'm going to do this and this and not this and this. What does that wish list look like of what's fair game and what's not fair game?
Great question. I mean, I do think this question of stands, I mean, I think Joe Biden came out and said we should all support it, and then nobody else has. And Facebook uses the term influence operations, but what you just described is an influence operation, and where activism fits into politics is a real issue. I mean, I think micro-targeting, I mean, I just really wish all the platforms would say we're not going to take political advertising. Because the truth is, I mean, I don't know how how do we actually police lies? And if it's about falsehoods, they will just skirt the line of what's misleading. But I think things like refusing to, I mean, the other question is leaked documents. If every politician uses oppositional research, if somebody comes along with that kind of stuff, are they really going to use it when they don't know where it's come from? I mean, I think that things like leaked documents, things like micro-targeting, which I don't know how we do, so I'd like to get it all gone, are the main things that I don't think we've wrapped our head around. And we're not going to do it before 2020. Something dreadful will happen, and then they'll be like, oh, we should have seen this coming.
Yeah, that's actually true.
Yeah. I think more transparency in general enables people to sort of see what's what, right? So like in the Ted Cruz thing, if all these messages said, sent with this app, then people start, stop freaking out and be like, oh, I see what's going on, right? Similarly, if you have like a profile that says, operated in Ukraine, you can start asking questions. So I think like, which happened recently, right?
Yeah,
There was this big I Love Trump page was like, operated from Ukraine, and people were like,
But Facebook didn't find it, journalists found it.
well, that's what I'm saying. Like, if you have more transparency, then you have smarter people, investigative journalists, investigative groups, consumer advocacy groups who are able to do this type of work and say, hey, what the fuck is going on here, right? So I think in general, more labeling of the complexity of these information environment helps people look for those signals and see when something's odd.
Yeah. Yeah, I really love that point you mentioned of like, why has no politician said this is what we're not doing? That's definitely a thing that's missing. You guys have done a lot of panels together. I think the audience can tell that even 'cause with the report.
First time we're getting paddles.
But always from now on.
Yeah.
I'm not going to travel without a paddle.
Yeah, you should
I
walk
like
with
that you
those.
can't get the porn off your paddle.
Because you look like the witch from
That's
Wicked.
what I'm talking
Look at
about.
your
Like,
hands.
this
Look.
But anyway,
I don't look like a
Is
witch
this song
from Wicked.
Yeah, you do. Well, I'm going to have to
I was going to ask you guys, you guys probably have a good sense of, what things always get talked about when you talk about disinformation and what things never get talked. Like, you guys could make the drinking game of like disinformation panel
Bingo.
drinking game
Yeah.
or bingo.
That means
or
when we got
whatever.
the bingo sheet out here and we don't know about
You guys
it.
can make it. But I want to ask, like, what are some things that never gets talked about when it comes to disinformation that needs to get talked about?
So,
You go first.
okay. So we all have our little rabbit holes, right? And like one that Claire and I were just talking about is, I think about the big Russian campaign that targeted the US in 2016, right? We talked about it so much, right? It was headlines on headlines on headlines, and data was shared, and congressional reports were written. I wrote some of them, and it's just like, this constant overload of information about what happened in 2016. Yet, there are a few things that did happen in 2016 that we never talk about, and that as a result create little taboos that prevent us from actually being ready for more campaigns of the sort. One of them is a lot of these big troll campaigns use private messaging, emails, DMs to target journalists and activists and citizens directly. We're under the impression that like Russian trolls basically like just put out a bunch of tweets and the tweets were fun and some people retweeted it and really what's the harm in it, right? But in reality, you had a much more insidious, profound and complicated campaigns where journalists were being fed material, where activists were being funded and manipulated. And because we haven't gone through the bottom of this, because we haven't unpacked exactly what happened, because we had never heard those stories and because we never put those data on the table, we're not really acknowledging how insidious and complicated those more complicated campaigns can be. And again, I think for the groups who were targeted, and for the media in particular, that's a hell of a blind spot.
Yeah.
But also, nobody wants to be the person like, oh, whoops, I got fooled.
Yeah.
Like, so that's part of the problem is, and that's why we're not hearing about it. But the real vulnerability for 2020 is local news in the US, which has had its heart ripped out anyway. So you've got under-resourced newsrooms with many journalists that would love to get out of local and potentially move to national. You get there in a place where they haven't been trained, they haven't got the editorial oversight, and you've got a number of problems there. So if you try and go to somebody at the New York Times and hand them some problematic content, they're going to be like, no. But if you go to 5 different local newsrooms and they publish it, and then you go to the New York Times, I'm like, oh, your colleagues have done something. I mean, the playbook is already out there, but we're not having that conversation because it's all about people being manipulated because the mainstream media, and to be fair, they also used activist groups and communities of color and other communities who are more vulnerable to these messages. And we're not protecting them, we're not training them, we're not seeing that as part of the information ecosystem.
No. We're not even doing the basic due diligence of investigating what targeted them a few years ago, frankly. So that's one. The other thing that I would love is that we stop lumping all these issues together, right? Like what we call disinformation now is so complex and touches upon so many different topics that I don't think is going to be helpful going forward to just like keep on, stacking everything. Recently, we published a report on a campaign that was run by a Chinese network to do anti-human rights messaging on multiple platforms. And people were like, oh yeah, that's great. Also, my grandmother on Facebook, she's like completely off her rocker. I'm like, those are not the same issues. Like, I'm sorry that, like news feeds are poorly set up and you think outrage is winning on social media. But like, we have to start and separate what are the different lanes of disinformation problems? How do we talk about them? they all have different solutions. Some belong to cybersecurity, some belong to consumer protection, some belong to media training. Like, at some point, I think we should no longer have disinformation panels. We should like maybe that's the last disinformation panel. Because it's like, what are you talking about? Is it the Russians? Is it your grandma? Is it bots? Like, you know.
And also, can I add?
Retiring from panel, nice.
Because for the last 3 years, everybody's just been like, oh my God, disinformation. The normal ethical boundaries that would exist have kind of been thrown out of the window. So you have different disinformation conferences when you've got like a sweet librarian called Barbara from the Midwest next to somebody from the NSA. Because Barbara's there to talk about media literacy, and the NSA dude is there about how do we do surveillance of state actors.
Yeah.
And the truth is, they're very different communities, and they normally would not be in the same room. And so questions about who funds whose technology is okay to use, where does monitoring tip into surveillance, really big questions that
Super
like
important
that
questions.
here would just be like normal. We just kind of work those things out. When it comes to disinformation, those questions are not being asked, those guidelines are not being created because everybody's like, oh, yeah, but the Russians.
Yeah, it's
And
like
so we're
moral
not helping
panic.
ourselves.
Put Barbara, the NSA, give them data, we're freaking out, you know? Like, this is not helpful.
Poor Barbara, like she's
I
just trying
know.
to do her job.
That's what I'm saying. Like, poor
Or like,
Barbara.
so for example, the ethics of like scraping open WhatsApp groups. Like everybody like, oh, we can't get into WhatsApp groups. And so what you hear is academics say exactly the same as platforms would say, which is like, well, we need to have this data because we need to understand what's going on. I mean, the platforms are also trying to use it for advertising, but you know, we don't have standards around whether or not we should be scraping open WhatsApp groups. And if we're going to do it, how do we secure the data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so from UNICEF for scraping open WhatsApp groups in Pakistan to find about polio rumors, academics in Brazil are trying to do it, researchers trying to do it because they actually just want to, you know, get up on the CV ladder. I mean, we're just not thinking through these things. We don't have a set of ethical guidelines around scraping closed messaging.
Yeah.
Like that's just a basic we should be having.
But you know, the thing that's fun though is like, because we're stuck on our like disinformation industrial complex. I know you like the sentence. Like we're stuck in this thing and we're like, all our issues are really new and we do new rules for our own new issues. Like there are a lot of like really smart scholars that have been using internet data to do serious scholarship. And they have a lot of like very clear ethical guidelines and thoughts about when you can break terms of services and when it's a terrible idea. What do you do for security and what do you do for privacy? And they're kind of like, who the fuck are those super agitated misinfo people who are oh my God, scraping is new? Like, they must think we're nuts. Like, we also have to like land back and learn from all the guidelines and ethical principles that are generally in place from other fields that we should be learning from.
I enjoyed the stat. There's like 120 ethics guidelines for AI, but nobody's talking to one another. I was like, that sounds like our field.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm bummed to hear this is going to be the last disinformation panel of all time because it sounds like we have a lot of other stuff to cover. But now we should do audience Q&A. Does anybody have any questions? There's one in the back, one over here, one over here. I'll defer to Kevin.
I mean, I guess the obvious question here is sort of a who watches the Watchmen type thing, where why should we trust you to accurately tell us what is disinformation or not?
I thought this came through very clearly. We're not to be trusted.
But in general, obviously, it still is.
But I think this is the question that we're trying to say, right? Like, you can't just show up and be like, oh, wow, disinformation is so new, it's so important, let us do our thing, right? Like, it's a terrible idea. We need ethical guidelines. We need watchdogs for the watchdogs. We need a serious field with, like, clear ethical standards and standards of rigor. And we need some processes for peer reviewing, even for non-scholarly work, right? So like in a normal field, you can't just show up and like make something up out of ethical guidelines that you thought about last night based on some principles of rigor that you just made up, you know, over drinks with friends, right? Like we need to sort of evolve this new misinformation field into something that's more structured and frankly more accountable for the people who operate within them. So definitely agree, do not trust us.
And partly because, not Graphika, but there are other organizations that are part of the disinformation industrial complex who are basically they do some analysis, they write a press release, they send to journalists to say, here's evidence of a coordinated campaign that was organized by Russia. And you're like, okay, can you give me access to the data lake? Can you tell me how you did that? No, we couldn't possibly. And what you have is a lot of really problematic journalism where they have no understanding of how to do the attribution correctly, and they don't understand how this research has been done in the first place. And so, to Camille's point, the only way that we can watch the Watchmen is by having transparent principles about how we understand and attribute these campaigns to certain state actors. And certainly, you know, we are both European but live in the US. You can spend time in US meetings as if the US has never itself been involved in any of these types of campaigns.
Yeah.
So like this is a really challenging, complex problem that requires a level of transparency from everybody to understand what's really happening.
All right, next question. I'll once again defer to Kevin. Let's go. Excuse me. question coming up.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. I have two questions. The first, you alluded to it now. We talk a lot about Russian misinformation, disinformation campaigns, and a lot less about the role that Western governments and states play in this. And I'd love to hear more about what's the research on this, how do we tackle this problem? Because it must exist as well. It would be naive to assume it isn't. And the second one, coming from like a data privacy security background, we're very concerned about the use of data in targeting of political advertisement, the use of data broker data. How do you see the relationship between this and misinformation, disinformation?
Do you want to tackle the state actors one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's an official answer, and there's the complex thing that goes with it. The official answer is the field of disinformation has agreed that state actors in general shouldn't be using deceptive methods in order to, interfere with democratic processes and do election interference. And in general, if you listen to the industry, so if you listen to the tech platforms, they would tell you that what really matters isn't really who's behind it, it's just the fact that governments are using these techniques. That's sort of like, on the record, everyone agrees that no government should do that. Now, in reality, no Western government ever gets caught doing this type of activity, which is interesting because, of course, it goes to like, well, perhaps those are not being investigated, those are not being prioritized. That creates, for me, two questions. The first one is a policy question. The second one is an investigative question. On the investigative side, I don't know if there are enough people looking at the types of campaign that the US and France and the UK could be running that are using the same techniques. We know that some of these campaigns have been discussed. So for instance, known examples where government used fake profiles to target specific communities. We have some of those in counterterrorism, for instance. So it's not a taboo that people have been thinking about that. The other answer, besides the who's doing the forensics and taking this problem seriously, is a diplomatic answer, right? Similarly to we don't really have candidates saying here's what we don't do, we don't really have governments saying here's what we don't do. In cyberspace, there is something as norms, right? So you could totally see a government saying like, hey, by the way, we will not use covert social media campaign in order to interfere in the democratic processes of other geopolitical allies or enemies. That's not really a conversation we're hearing, so I'm kind of like, interested in seeing who are the first nations who are going to be saying this.
If you haven't watched Alex Gibney's documentary 0 Days, which is about US and Israel's hacking of Iran to basically take over a power station, what's so powerful about the documentary is that you see a kind of a computer-generated image of all of the NSA whistleblowers who basically said, I know that my country has to think about these sorts of things, but what concerns me is we have no playbook for this. And if we're doing it, what the hell is everybody else doing back to us? And so the reason I think the documentary is interesting is it's simply saying what we can do with technology is so powerful, and yet we haven't thought it through. And so we have these conversations at these kind of conferences about AI, but in this space, and it's not, we're not being naive, it's how the world works, but we're just not having those conversations.
I'm making a face because it's a 2-hour-long documentary about cyber warfare without a single fucking woman in it.
Yeah. True story. Like Bellingcat joke. What was it? Oh, and the other question about micro-targeting. So I also want to say this because what I think is fascinating is, okay, the movie The Great Hack on Netflix, many of us have seen it. It's not necessarily the greatest film of all time, but you know what it did? It got released on the same day in 93 countries, and it did more to get more people aware of the challenges of data and what that meant around micro-targeting than anything else. And apparently it kind of like broke the Netflix algorithm. And Netflix was like, how do we get people to, like, what should they do now? Because they're all hungry to do something. And despite 3 years of convenings on this issue, we have nothing to give the public. We have nothing to say, this is what you should do. And so for me, to your question, if we're trying to get the mums of the world engaged, it is around data. It is around how that intersects with hate and disinformation and misinformation. But I don't think that we've got beyond talking on panels, which is why we should stop having these panels, and actually come up with a tool set to actually give or tools to people to say, this is what I should do when I suddenly learn about it and get angry. So I think data and disinformation are really closely connected. As ever in this space, they tend to be different panels at different conferences funded by different organizations, and we don't talk to each other. But really, for me, that's the sweet spot of how these two things should be working together.
Nice. Well, I think we'll do one more question, actually, yeah.
I mean, it is the last panel on Disinfo.
Yeah,
so
it better be
we
a
can
good
have
question.
one more
This is the
question.
last question of any disinformation panel.
Thank you. So I am running a workshop tomorrow, designing a policy lab on deepfakes, and it's at 2:00. And I'm wondering if you can get us started by putting some ideas out there, like how do you tackle a problem like deepfakes?
You go, then I'll go.
Okay, teach everyone how to deepfake. Just no, seriously. Like you'll see, it's easy. It's quite fun. It's not as bad as people think. It's kind of clunky, and just demystify it. That's my. I feel like I've just said out loud a terrible idea. We'll see.
It is.
We'll see how that lands.
The best way to teach disinformation is to get people to come up with a disinformation campaign. So I do think you're onto something.
Yeah.
Firstly,
Just don't put it on the internet.
Firstly, read all the stuff that Witness has done on this, because they've done an incredible job and they're working with activists globally around the deepfake conversation. Again, is very US focused, and so it tends to be a lot of white men in Silicon Valley talking about deepfakes. When actually, if they've done great work in places like Brazil, who are like, this is what we're terrified about. We're already seeing some pretty problematic legislation around deepfakes because it's focused on the content. And if we focus on content, we're going to end up taking out stuff like satire and other spaces that I think we are not necessarily thinking about now. So that worries me. And so it should really be about behaviors. So whenever we're thinking about regulation in this space, we've really got to, how do we understand behaviors? And the thing is, that's hard, because to Camille's point, we focus on content because we can get access to that. It's very difficult to understand behaviors because we can't get access to the data that the platforms have, which would help us understand behaviors. But I would say around deepfakes, we need to be really careful. It's a very sexy topic. Everybody's wading in and saying, oh, that's something that we can easily regulate. But I don't think it's as easy as we think it is, and it's still very, very early days in terms of the technology. So my worry is that we regulate too early, but at the same time, we do have to recognize the fears, but just all about the porn, anything you can do about that, that'd be great, thanks.
All right, I think that's it for us. Thank you guys, Camille and Claire, for joining me today.